faré la presentació en anglès, o sigui que la podreu escoltar, però en qualsevol cas, moltes gràcies per venir i estem molt agraïts per part de l'Ateneu, de l'organització de la fundació aquesta que es diu MOVE i de la Fundació Ramon Areces. Moltes gràcies. I els que sou de l'Ateneu sabeu que aquest és el segon acte que organitzem des de que soc jo ponent de la secció d'Economia. Us animo a que vingueu al proper, ja us anirem informant. Good afternoon. I'm going to speak in English now so that you all can relate and can understand. Thank you for coming to the roundtable on the economic and political consequences of Brexit. This event, which is the second, I am the new ponent of the section of Economy and Ateneo, I think is an example of what kind of events I would like to organize, a conference I would like to organize in the future. The subject is very topical, so it's today everybody's talking about it. It's very interesting and with first-rate speakers. And for that I have to thank the Fundación MOVE, we have here the president Juan Urrutia, and also the Fundación Ramon Areces. And actually the Universitat Autónoma, Raúl, and all the ones who are organizing it, because you've done a very good job. Thank you very much. The conference on Brexit is a difficult job to do because it's changing every day as negotiations keep going on, and the circumstances change, and one day you think you're very close to an agreement, the following day it doesn't appear so. Although it's only 13 months away, so because the 30th of March of 2019, something is going to happen. What's going to happen is still to be, I guess that you are going to illustrate us what's going to happen on the 30th of March of 2019. But it keeps changing every day. So I do not want to waste more time because we have here the experts who are going to talk on the subject. The way we've thought about it is they're going to have each of them 10 minutes. Then we'll have a discussion between the panel, and afterwards we'll open for questions from the floor. So we have here today Ellen McGrattan, and they're going to talk in this order. Ellen is a professor of economics in Minnesota University, and she has a PhD from Stanford. Professor McGrattan has published lots of papers, and some of them on the effect of Brexit on foreign investment and production with Edward Prescott, the Nobel Prize Edward Prescott. Then we have Joe Steinberg, there, associate professor at Toronto, the economics department of Toronto. He has a PhD from Minnesota, and he has also written recently about the trade effects on Brexit. So he's going to talk, I guess, on trade, I don't know. Then we have Tom Sampson here. Will speak. He's an associate professor of economics at the London School of Economics, and he has a PhD from Harvard. And he has written extensively on Brexit and the cost and benefits of Brexit, and in blogs and quite a few places. So he has written a lot. Then we have Jaume Ventura, who is our local there, the professor at the Pompeu. He also has a PhD from Harvard, and he's written about lots of things, among them credit bubbles, so it's very interesting things. And finally, we will listen to Patrick Minford. He's a professor of government economics at Cardiff University, and he has taken a very active role in the group which was called then Economists for Brexit, and now has changed the name. He's just told me, but he's going to talk about it. And he wrote a book on Brexit on 2015 called Should Britain Leave the European Union? An Economic Analysis of a Troubled Relationship. So without further ado, and they have every each of them 10 minutes, and I'm going to show them when they are finishing. Thank you.
I don't know which one is me or which one is that. I don't know. Mine's in panel.
You don't know?
No,
You're supposed to.
There are 4, so there's a good chance.
That's a good question.
Don't know which yours. Mine was called panel when I gave it to her.
Do you have it nearby?
That's not. Is
It is not.
No.
if Marta is here, she'll know.
Where's Marta? You don't know.
It's yours.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Marta? No.
we're gonna,
I think we're missing
És que
one.
on estan? És que no sabem on estan
ja la trobarem, no patiu.
la seva presentació
I si no, la Helen també ho farà molt bé.
de l'Helen.
Està?
És que no ho sabem.
Mm.
No, aquesta no.
I don't
Ah,
see.
hi ha 4 presentacions i som 5. Aleshores,
There's too few.
hi ha una que no ha arribat.
Aquí no hi és, per si la va enviar la Marta. La Marta, on està la Marta Vallejo? No, estrany.
Aquí no hi és.
Okay, fine. Then let's do Marta. Yes. Ellen's presentation is not here.
Val.
Okay.
Therefore, we are 5. One doesn't need to be shoveled.
Perdoneu,
What was the name of it? What's the name of it? Okay.
No, és que l'ha magrat. És aquesta. És aquesta. Sí.
They found it. Yes.
No, sorry. At least you have yours.
Yay.
That's something.
Modo pantalla completa. Modo pantalla completa.
Okay.
I Marta? Marta? Okay,
Do you want me
Ellen,
to
go
begin?
ahead, yes.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for having me. I wanted to talk about some work I've been doing with co-author Andrea Waddle. But let me start with the basics. We're talking about the dissolution of an economic union. Economic unions have the advantage that they allow greater mobility of people, goods and services, or trade, investment. Investment can come in two types: portfolio investment, which is usually households holding stocks and bonds in foreign companies. That's usually small ownership. And then foreign direct investment, which is companies setting up plants, subsidiaries in foreign countries. We're very interested in the foreign direct investment. There's been very little attention on that. It's mostly people and trade, but I'm going to try to argue that you don't want to forget about investment. It's mostly done by multinational companies, and the reason you don't want to forget about it is what companies do. The reason they're doing a foreign direct investment is they've already accumulated what I'll refer to as technology capital. But think of, the results of research and development, branding of products. A lot of companies, they invest heavily in their companies, and they take those investments and use it simultaneously all over the world, both in their home subsidiaries and in the foreign subsidiaries. There are huge potential gains in well-being, or we call it welfare as economists, for those who host FDI, because they can take advantage of somebody else doing the investment and bringing new and better technologies into the country. It's better, you can take these technologies and you can couple it with labor and capital within the country, and you're going to get higher wages and higher returns. It's a win-win for both the companies and the hosts. What we do in our work is we consider we view the Brexit from the perspective of economic theory. So we write down a theoretical model where households are all maximizing. They choose consumption and how much to work and how much to save, subject to budget constraints. The companies, the multinationals, put their technologies around the world, and they maximize dividends for the owners of those companies, the households. Governments set policy, and they regulate the capital flows around the world. So the paper, we're looking at that regulation of capital flows. In an economic union, it can move freely. When you have a dissolution or a Brexit, there can be barriers put up, higher costs on the movement into foreign countries. We look at 3 possible scenarios. One that I would say is unlikely, whereby the UK exits the Union and increases costs on all of the things that, movement of people, movement of trade, but in particular movement of FDI flows in. The more likely scenario is that the EU and the UK have a divorce, a messy one. So there's retaliation. And in this divorce, they put barriers against each other's companies, so the flows of FDI on each other. And then I'll take quite seriously the words of Theresa May of the UK that one outcome of Brexit may be that there'd be different negotiated deals on goods, people, and FDI with other countries, so that there would be lower costs of capital flows from the US, Japan, and other countries. Let me start with, suppose the UK unilaterally increased cost on EU FDI. So investment coming in to the UK. The most obvious thing that's going to happen is inward FDI will fall. That's costs go up, the activity will fall. What's maybe less obvious is what happens to production. So these multinationals, what they're doing is they're doing a lot of investment in R&D. And if the costs on the EU FDI fall, that means companies in Britain are going to have to reinvent some wheels that were being produced in another country, in the EU. So they will have to start increasing investment, and that's costly to them. It's kind of like, so we'll see increases in output and employment, and everyone will say, wow, this is all really good. It's kind of like if there's a hurricane and everything gets smashed down and you see a lot of investment and saving, and people say, oh, that's really good. Well, it's not really good because you've lost some capital. Okay, so you have to be able to understand why the output and employment are going up. And in this case, it would be for all the wrong reasons. In particular, what we'd see is the welfare of the citizens of the UK, or the owners of the multinationals in the UK, would have lower consumption and lower leisure. And we would call that a welfare loss. So even though we'd see higher output and higher employment, it would be a bad outcome. Why? Because they're not exploiting investment that has already been done by somebody else. Let me have a look at the EU. So here we are sitting in the EU. What happens there if the UK unilaterally increases? Well, they take advantage of the UK increasing their R&D. So if they didn't do anything, if you didn't retaliate, all good. Because the UK will start innovating more, doing more. If you allow it into the subsidiaries in the EU, you gain from them doing more investment. So the EU multinationals would do a little bit less R&D. Some people would say, oh, that's bad, but no, they're doing less of the costly activity. And there'd be a little bit of a fall in output employment, and some people might say that's bad, but it's because they're getting some free stuff. Welfare in that case in the EU would actually go up slightly. Consumption would be barely changed. There'd be slight increase in leisure, and utility would rise. If, as is most likely going to happen, the EU retaliates, so there's a messy divorce, there'd be inward FDI drops here in Spain and in other countries in the EU. The EU companies would, because they're going to lose from they're now blocking the UK, and the UK's blocking them, everybody's blocking, so they would have to be increasing their investment in R&D. Depending on the sizes of these countries are different, and the amount of this activity they're doing is different, so There are going to be scenarios where output and employment rise and scenarios where they fall. It depends on certain magnitudes. But for sure, consumption is going to fall and utility will fall. Welfare will be lost. We put some numbers, we go to the data and we match, we take the model and we match it to the data pre-Brexit, and then we run some scenarios, different scenarios where the UK only moves, where both the UK and the EU become less open. And then we look at the case that Theresa May is talking about, whereby the UK becomes more open to other countries. These numbers summarize the present discounted value of utility or well-being of the citizens in the country. You'll see that if the UK acted alone, bad news, big drop in welfare. If the EU retaliates and shoots themselves a little bit in the foot, then things are kind of even, it acts slight, because they're gaining from the large amount of investment in the EU. But what the UK should really be doing is opening up to US, Japan, and others, because that's where there are big gains. There's lots of investment that they're not letting in. In these scenarios, the EU just stayed the same. We didn't assume that they opened more. But the punchline here is that they should open more. What's the main lesson? Don't block technology. Technology is usually coupled with foreign direct investment. The blocking countries have to do it themselves. They have to reinvent wheels, and the non-blocking countries, they take advantage of somebody else doing the work for them. I want to just say one little plug for using theory. This is these models can be very complicated because you've got many countries. We had 13 countries in the model. All the countries respond. All the countries will change the amount of investment they do because capital can move where needed. So it gets very complicated, and you sort of need theory to understand. It's hard to do it just by looking at data. And I'll end with that.
Thank you, Ellen. Now, Joe, but I don't know, you need the presentation as well. I don't know whether you can manage to have the PC over there. We'll have to move afterwards because you have to move over there. Two of you.
Okay, great. So,
Great.
here we go. Anyway, I just wanted to thank everybody for inviting me. It's really great to be here. I'm going to use my time today to tell you a little bit about some of the research that I've got in progress, in which I try to evaluate what's the macroeconomic impact of uncertainty about Brexit. So, let me start by just showing you a picture illustrating that, as probably many of you noticed, right after the Brexit vote, there were all kinds of speculation in pundits, popular press, policymakers, that uncertainty about what policies would replace EU membership in the future would cause immediate harm to the UK economy in the present, right? If you look, though, at some recent data about the UK's macroeconomic performance, what you see is that there's really not that much evidence that this harm has materialized yet. So what I've done here is just split this data up into 3 periods. The 3 years prior to the Referendum Act being introduced to Parliament, 2 between the Act's passage and between the vote itself, and then the third column is just the most recent data actually since the vote. And basically what you see here is that, real GDP growth, consumption growth, investment, trade, roughly similar performance in all 3 periods. A few differences here and there, but there's no evidence of a clear, significant recession or anything like that yet. So basically what I'm doing this research is trying to evaluate what is the cost of uncertainty about Brexit. And what that comes down to really at its core is trying to answer what would the UK economy have done, what would consumers, firms, et cetera, have done if they knew for sure what kind of Brexit outcome they were going to get. And for that, you need a model. So what I'm going to do is develop a model in which I can compare different simulations in which consumers and firms have different beliefs and expectations about what might happen. In particular, I'm going to compare a simulation in which these economic agents are uncertain about what kind of Brexit they're going to get to some other simulations in which they have what I call perfect foresight. They know for sure what they're going to get. And it's important to mention that I'm going to focus in particular about on trade policy uncertainty. So I'm not going to talk about foreign direct investment like Ellen did. I'm not going to talk about immigration. I'm going to be talking solely about trade costs. And so in my model, there are going to be two possible outcomes I think that most people are familiar with here. Soft Brexit, in which trade costs rise a little bit. Hard Brexit, in which trade costs rise a lot. And what I'm going to try to convince you is two things, basically. Overall, the cost of Brexit for UK households, at least as far as trade policy is concerned, is quite large. But the cost of uncertainty is, indeed, as I've hinted at, quite small. Before I get into what exactly I do, let me just give you a little bit of additional context for why some economists believe that policy uncertainty can have significant macroeconomic effects, in particular trade policy uncertainty. And so for that, we're going to go back to 1980, when the United States significantly liberalized its trade policies with respect to China, lowered tariffs on Chinese imports by about 27%. What was interesting about this particular policy reform was that it had to be renewed annually by US Congress. And so the duration and permanence of this reform was uncertain. And in 2000, when China joined the World Trade Organization, this uncertainty was resolved. It made these trade reforms permanent, and even though tariffs didn't change, US tariffs on Chinese imports didn't change when China joined the WTO, there was a huge surge in US imports of Chinese goods. And lots of researchers have attributed this surge to, in fact, that elimination of trade policy uncertainty. And their explanation sounds a lot like, I think, what people have talked about relating to Brexit uncertainty. Namely that Chinese firms, facing this uncertainty, postponed decisions about, making large investments to enter the export market until this uncertainty was resolved. And so that's kind of where I'm coming at this, at the Brexit situation. So here's what I do. I develop a model that has a lot of the same basic ingredients that I think Ellen's model had. There are three countries here, the UK, the EU, and the rest of the world. Each country or region, I guess, has households that consume, they work, invest, and save. Each country's got firms that produce output using labor, capital, and intermediate inputs. And the key thing here, I think, is that to enter a foreign market, to export, a firm has got to pay a large upfront sunk cost. And because of that, uncertainty can, in the model, and I think probably in the real world, cause some firms to delay decisions about export participation, delay making these big upfront costs until uncertainty is resolved. So what I do with the model to start with is I calibrate all of its parameters, and there are many of them, so that what we call its equilibrium matches all kinds of data on production and trade patterns in 2011. And I think this is a good starting point. It's well before Brexit really entered the public consciousness. Okay, so from that point, I run the model forward. And as I said, I envision two possible Brexit outcomes. And in fact, I'm modeling these in exactly the same way that Professor Sampson in some of his research has modeled these two possible outcomes. Maybe he'll speak more about that. So soft Brexit and hard Brexit. Soft Brexit occurs, the UK remains in the customs union, and tariffs do not rise. I have allowed for other kinds of trade costs, which we call non-tariff barriers, to rise a little bit, reflecting perhaps increased costs of abiding by different regulations, etc. If hard Brexit occurs, the UK does leave the customs union, tariffs actually do rise, and these non-tariff trade barriers rise more. So hard Brexit is more severe. It's important to mention that for what I'm going to show you today, both of these scenarios are going to be equally likely in my model, 50% chance of each. It's also important to mention that I've considered a wide range of alternative scenarios. None of them really meaningfully affect any of my results. Okay, so that's the model. How are we going to measure the impact of Brexit uncertainty? So to start with, I'm going to do the first simulation, which I'm going to call the benchmark. This is the one in which there is uncertainty. Here's how it works. In 2016, consumers and firms in the model learn that Brexit's going to occur in 2019, but they don't yet learn which outcome they're going to get. They've got to wait until 2019 to learn whether Brexit's going to be hard or soft. With that simulation in hand, I'm going to conduct some other ones. First, to measure the overall impact of Brexit in the model, I'm going to compare that benchmark simulation with what I call the no Brexit counterfactual. It's a simulation in which Brexit never happens at all. And then to measure the impact of uncertainty about Brexit, I'm going to compare that benchmark with what I call perfect foresight counterfactual simulations. There are two of them, one each for soft Brexit and hard Brexit. And they're identical to the benchmark simulation, except that consumers, firms, and agents in the model learn immediately in 2016 whether Brexit is going to be hard or soft. So the only difference between these perfect foresight simulations and the benchmark is that presence of uncertainty. Okay, so before I get to the main results, I just want to show you what these simulations look like. So here I'm plotting the dynamics of UK GDP starting from 2015 onwards. So the blue line here depicts what I call the pre-Brexit scenario. So this is between the period when agents in the model learn that Brexit's going to happen, but before they learn what kind of Brexit they're going to get, right? And you can see that GDP falls a little bit, but not much. Once 2019 rolls around, the simulation forks, we get soft or hard Brexit. Soft Brexit's in green, GDP falls a little bit more, hard Brexit falls quite a bit more. So now here all I'm going to do is add two more lines. These are the perfect foresight simulations. The perfect foresight version of soft Brexit's the dotted teal line. The perfect foresight version of hard Brexit is the dotted orange line. And look, don't worry if you can't quite make them out, you can't quite distinguish them from the benchmark. That's the whole point. They look almost identical to the benchmark simulations, right? That suggests Brexit uncertainty is not that costly in the model. Okay, so with that, let me leave you with the main results here. The table at the top just shows you the overall impact of Brexit in the model. And you can see that depending on what kind of Brexit we get, it can be pretty costly. Trade with the rest of the EU falls by quite a bit. UK consumers lose out for sure. In the case of hard Brexit, they lose about 1% of welfare. What does that really mean? Well, that means that the average UK household would be willing to pay about £7,000 upfront once to avoid soft Brexit, about £18,000 to avoid hard Brexit. So those are pretty big numbers. It's pretty costly. Uncertainty about Brexit, however, that has a small impact. The welfare losses in my model coming from uncertainty are pretty small. They amount to less than 1% of the overall welfare losses. The way that I like to think about it, I think the way that's the easiest way to relate to this is to say that the average UK household would pay less than £50 to have learned what kind of Brexit outcome they were going to get immediately in 2015, rather than having to wait, right? So that's not much more than you'd have to pay, for one night out at the pub, right? Okay, so that's what I've got. Thank you very much for listening.
Joseph. And now, Thomas, it's your turn. I don't know how we're going to manage.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe you can switch the names as well, the name tags. Switch the name tags. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here, so thank you for having me here this evening. So what I want to do with my time is kind of touch briefly on three questions. I want to say a little bit about give an overview of how economists have tried to think about what the consequences of Brexit might be. Then I want to say something about the Brexit vote itself, who actually ended up voting for Brexit, and I'm going to speculate a little bit about why that might have been. And then the third thing I want to do is say something about what we've seen happen to the UK economy since the vote occurred. So imagine you're working for the UK government and your minister comes to you and says, we're thinking about leaving the EU. We need to know how this is going to affect the UK's economy. How are you going to go away and answer this question? Okay. Now, ideally as a researcher, what you would like to do in this circumstance is you'd like to go to the historical data and look for a case where kind of a country that looks something like the UK left an economic union that looks something like the EU, and observed what happened following that kind of that breakup of the union. Right? Now, if we could observe such a case study, that would give us kind of a good indication of how Brexit might affect the UK. The problem, obviously, is that there's no such precedent. There's no historical case that we can really learn from for the UK leaving the EU. So this makes the kind of research problem more difficult, and it means we have to kind of use more indirect methods to try and understand what consequences Brexit might be. Right? So people have tried to get around this problem in three ways, and I want to just very briefly mention each of them. Right? So one of them is that we don't have examples of countries leaving the EU, but we do have lots of cases where countries have joined the EU. And we can study what happened to economies after they joined the EU. So the UK joined the EU in 1973. And if you look at the period from 1973 until the financial crisis in 2007, it was a relatively good period for the UK economy. The UK grew more strongly than kind of other economies like France and Germany. Right? So people have kind of taken this episode and they've tried to estimate, what would the UK's growth have been if it hadn't joined the EU? And they've concluded that the UK grew more strongly because of its EU membership. Right? Now, does that tell us anything about what will happen when we leave? Well, it's kind of suggestive. You might expect that if you benefit from joining, there will be a cost of leaving. Right? But at the same time, clearly, there might also be asymmetries that affect that process. Right? But that's kind of what we can get from the sort of historical case studies. Second approach, right, and we've seen two examples of this already this evening that Ellen and Joe have talked about, is to get a little bit more theoretical and use economic models to try and understand the effects of Brexit. So this, in broad terms, involves writing down, a model of the global economy, calibrating that model to fit the data, as Ellen and Joe did in their work, and then simulating Brexit. Right? And we can do this by thinking about Brexit as changes in trade costs between the UK and the EU, or changes in barriers to FDI or to migration. So we did some work at LSE, kind of looking at this issue, where we focused not on FDI, but in changes in trade costs in a similar way to Joe did in the paper he just talked about. And thought about, what would be, we didn't think about uncertainty, but we thought about, what would be the welfare consequences to the UK, either in the kind of soft Brexit, stay in the single market case, or in the hard Brexit, no deal, revert to WTO case. Right? So this picture kind of summarizes our result. You can see there's kind of a lineup of countries along the top, and then for each country, the red bar gives the welfare effect in the optimistic soft Brexit case, and then the blue bar in the hard Brexit case. I'd highlight three things that this graph is showing. One is that the effects are negative, both for the UK and for all other EU countries. Second, the costs are much bigger for the UK and also for Ireland, because it's really closely integrated with the UK economy, than they are for other EU countries. And that's because the EU kind of matters more to the UK than vice versa, because the EU is big relative to the UK. Right? And then the third thing is you'll see that in all cases, the losses are bigger in the no-deal case than in the soft Brexit case. Right? And this is something we see in our work, but it's kind of a common theme in the literature, that the closer the UK stays to the EU, the smaller the economic costs of Brexit. And then the third approach that has been taken, which is more kind of based in sort of data and empirical work than in structural modeling, has been to combine data on, what do we know about how EU membership affects trade with what we know about how trade affects income per capita. So we can attempt to estimate both of those things using observed trade flows and observed variation in income levels across countries. Right? Neither of those things are necessarily easy to do, and there's going to be a lot of uncertainty around any estimates. But if we take that approach, kind of the numbers we come up with is that if the UK were to leave the EU and to join a kind of free trade agreement that's not as deep as the single market, maybe something like the EU-Canada free trade agreement, the cost to the UK economy would be a fall in income per capita somewhere between 6% and about 9.5%. Right? So one interesting thing that comes out of that is that these costs are typically bigger than the costs that come out of the more structural models of Brexit. It's hard to know exactly why, but we think probably an important reason is that, you know, each of the structural models that have been used to look at this issue kind of focus on a particular channel. So Ellen looked at FDI, we looked at trade, Joe focused on uncertainty. The more data-driven estimates might be kind of picking up all these different channels. So there might be kind of some summing up of the effects across different models. Okay. So, I mean, that was a very brief overview of kind of what is becoming quite a large literature on this topic. But what I would take away from it is that, you know, the consensus in this literature is that there will be an economic cost to Brexit. It's not a universal consensus. Patrick will give you a dissenting opinion in about 10 minutes' time. But most of the work suggests that there will be cost to Brexit and that they will be higher if the UK doesn't stay in the single market, which is currently the UK's policy. Right, so now just briefly, let me speak about two other things. One is the vote. So who actually ended up voting for Brexit? Broadly speaking, people were more likely to vote for Brexit if they were less educated, if they were older, if they lived outside of London or Scotland, and also if they were doing less well economically. There's also a strong correlation between voting for Brexit and a kind of socially conservative political attitudes broadly defined. Perhaps a more interesting question, though, is, you know, why did these voters, who are often referred to in the UK press as left-behind voters, why did the left-behind voters vote for Brexit? And I think that's a question we know less about, and I would hypothesize that, you know, there are kind of two plausible explanations for this. Right? One is the take-back control argument, that Brexit was UK voters expressing their wish to be sovereign from the EU and to take back control over economic policy and immigration. Right? And this is certainly the interpretation of the vote that the UK government has adopted, and that has been favoured by many on the Leave side. The other possible explanation, which has been more popular with Remain-leaning voters, is that really the vote kind of represents mistaken scapegoating of the EU. Right? That the UK popular press, which has typically been very Eurosceptic, and the success of things like the UK Independence Party have convinced voters that the EU kind of was responsible for their struggles and their woes, when actually, you know, it wasn't. Right? Now, I don't know, and I don't think the available data we have allows us to say which of those explanations is more important, but it's an area that's kind of really important for thinking about how we should respond to the Brexit vote. Right? If it's about taking back sovereignty, that seems like a very legitimate expression of democratic preference. If it's based on kind of mistaken beliefs, that's a very different problem we need to deal with. So then, just finally, what's happened to the UK economy since the vote? The most obvious thing that happened was the pound depreciated. Coming to Europe is now much more expensive for me than it was before the vote. So you can see here that, you know, the pound depreciated by about 10% against both the euro and the dollar immediately following the vote. And that's passed through to higher import prices in the UK. And we've seen the red line on this graph is UK inflation. So you can see that's increased sharply since the vote. And at the same time that prices have increased, real wages have declined. So that's how kind of UK consumers have mostly felt the vote so far, has been lower real wage growth. Final graph then, what about what's happened to GDP in the UK since the vote? Here the evidence I think is a little bit less clear. As kind of Joe highlighted, if you look at the level of GDP growth, it's been pretty stable before and after. However, what we do know is that since the vote, there's kind of been an uptick in growth in most other major economies. So if you compare, you know, the change in growth in the UK to other countries, there's some evidence that maybe UK growth has done less well since the vote. And the UK, in fact, has gone from kind of one of the fastest growing OECD economies to one of the slowest growing. So it's definitely too soon to say what the economic consequences of Brexit will be, but the early signs, I think, are a little bit worrying for the UK economy. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas. Now, Patrick, is your turn. Maybe you should. Jaume, sorry, Jaume. Now it's Jaume. Yes, definitely.
Okay, thanks for the invitation and thank you for coming here. I'm the one that has not been writing about Brexit and that has not been doing studies about Brexit. That's what I told Albert and Ro when they invited me, and that's what Ellen, Patrick and Tom reminded me when they arrived. They said, but Jaume, you have not written about Brexit. And I said, no, I have not. And I will now talk about the effects of Brexit on the UK, other than I have read their papers and other work on it as an interested citizen. But I've been thinking a little bit about the state in Europe. I've been doing some research on the state of Europe, and I want to think a little bit about what Brexit means. So what I'm going to do is to take a little bit of a longer-term view and see how we are coping, how Europe and the state in Europe is coping with globalization, and what are the forces, more long-term forces, that could have led to Brexit, and how do we interpret it for the future. So let me start by a few pictures. These pictures are nice pictures. This is the European state in 1815. Okay, so this is after the Congress of Vienna, the Napoleonic Wars, and so on and so forth. And you see, well, there's a lot of, you can see the map of Europe. Some pieces look similar, some others do not. What is interesting about this period is that after the Napoleonic Wars starts what the historians call the first wave of globalization. So it's a massive increase in trade, economic integration, and that has an effect on the state. And the effect on the state is very well understood. If you fast forward for a century, just at the beginning of the First World War, you realize that, if you look at the two figures, there's a process of of political integration. So it's a moment in which economic integration goes together with political integration. That happens not only in Europe, but since we are dealing with Brexit and Europe, I decided to show you the pictures just for Europe. Many other statistics show the same thing. Now, what happens? We know what happens. This is the picture with who entered the First World War and the interwar period. You know that during this time there is a backlash against globalization. Countries become much closer, and so on and so forth. And the second wave of globalization starts after the Second World War. And then you ask, how does the state cope with that? And what you observe, that if you take again, let's move 1 century forward, and if you look 1 century forward, you look at this. You see? You look at this, and you look at this. So now, interestingly, and this is something that many researchers have focused on, is that economic integration in the second wave of globalization seems to be leading to political disintegration. So in the first wave, there was a concentration. Economic integration and political integration were hand in hand. In the second, it doesn't seem to be so, at least when you look at countries. But on the other hand, in Europe, you can say, well, we see many more countries, we see many more disintegration, but don't we have a single market? Don't we have an economic union and so on? And actually that's true. If you look at the next one, if you see here, if you look at the colors in the bottom of the picture, these are the successive enlargements. The first one, the blue one, 1952, the original 7 countries. And then you have the addition of the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Denmark in yellow. Then it comes Greece with this purple color, Spain, and Portugal, and it keeps enlarging. So what we are building in Europe is integration in a different manner than before. Is integration in a two-level state. On the one hand, it seems that there is disintegration at the country level. On the other hand, we are closer because we have given a lot to the European Union. And actually, that has led to a lot of research in understanding why the state takes a particular shape. Why is it that we adopt this shape? Why is it that the first wave of globalization created larger and larger countries? Why is it that the second wave of globalization seems to be creating smaller countries and this supranational structure like the European Union in this case. Now, most of the research is focusing on a series. I'm going to give you like some broad brush paint or this, a little bit of the main ideas. Basically, most of this literature has focused on different forces that shape the structure of the state. On the one hand, we want to have states that are large, because economies of scale. We want to also foster trade. We want to be security. We want to have large markets. On the other hand, we don't like to have very large states because we have very different preferences, and that is very clear in Europe. We want to have different states that do different things. We have different views about welfare. We have different views about the way we should do education, treat pensions, different views about how should we educate our children, what are the right social norms. But actually having different levels of structures, even having an ideal world, we would have like different, many levels of government, each one depending on the particular task that this government is doing, but that's expensive. And what this literature has done is have realized that globalization, at least in Europe, is proceeding at very different speeds. On the one hand, economic globalization is moving very fast. We all have love for variety. We all love all types of goods that come from all over the world. I mean, a few decades ago, many people here didn't know what sushi was. Now everybody likes to eat sushi or to eat Mexican or to eat other stuff. So we have a love for variety when it comes to private goods, but we have variety of love when it comes to public goods. We want still our governments to be a little bit different and so on. And while this culture is also, there is globalization or cultural globalization, this cultural globalization is proceeding at a lower speed. And there is a bigger and bigger mismatch. And that's what has created this government at two steps. One larger government that deals with economics, one lower governments that deal with other aspects. This is a little bit what the story is. And then how does Brexit fit to this picture? And that's what I wanted to contribute to this talk today or this presentation. How does Brexit fit into this view? Aren't we moving towards a world in which this double level structure is useful? Why is it that the Brits decide to leave it? Is this a change in trend? Are we moving to something else? Well, I've been thinking a lot about it in the past. I've been talking to colleagues and thinking about what could be. I mean, a few things come to mind, and I want to just leave them here as a conjecture, perhaps for discussion with the other panelists and to talk a little bit about it. One possibility is just an accident. I mean, we know how voters behave. Sometimes they punish a particular party or particular people for a while. Perhaps in 3 years, ideas will come back to be different, the views will change, will come back, so on. I'm not so sure whether this is true. Another possibility is what I call sometimes the China effect. I mean, the reason to have a European Union and to have a big political structure that is above the countries is to create and protect the single market, is to create trade, to create foreign direct investment, as Ellen was talking, to help create all this mobility. But actually, this is true when the market is Europe. If globalization is proceeding very far away from Europe, then it doesn't make that much sense to have a European market. Perhaps the market is already the world. And then basically, when that is the situation, you don't get the gains, because you don't get the gains of a larger market. The market is the world anyway, but you get the costs of policy uniformity, the cost of having many decisions be chosen in Brussels, not following the tastes of people in London or people in Cardiff or people in Edinburgh. Okay, so that's one possibility. The other possibility is that Europe is not doing it well, a reaction to Europe overreaching. Perhaps the ideas are still okay. Perhaps we still want to have this two-level style government. Perhaps the European market still is special. There's closer integration within Europe with the rest of the world, and that matters. But obviously, the politicians in Europe are far away from the people. They are not out of control, and there is a maxim or a fundamental truth in politics that if any political agent can control a policy, it will. And the European Union is a very good example of that. Is an example of grabbing competencies, some of them that perhaps are not related what it was created in front, like things about agriculture, things about redistribution, and issues like that they have perhaps little scope. Another possibility is that it's very simple and very nice to have a theoretical model that you say, well, let's have a bigger structure that has the same scope as the market, that deals with all the economic issues, and that have smaller structures that deal with cultural elements and so on. Well, perhaps it's not possible to disentangle. One of the main issues in the Brexit discussion has been the very clear hostility against immigration, which one looks at studies of the effects of immigration on wages, on employment, and so on, and most of the studies find that these effects are quite small, although there are divergent views, but most find they're quite small. But actually, all our political theory is based on the notion that we have different preferences, that we would like to have our government to behave a little bit different than what the other regions, other countries would like. It's normal that if we don't want to share a government or a country with other parts of Europe, perhaps we don't want to share it with people from those regions either. There's something about the culture and the cultural clash that we need to understand much better, because the hostility to immigration is not about economics. It's not about economics. Finally, and that's my last point to say, is I would like to think also about war and conflict. I mean, Europe and the UK, as one of the great contributors, or perhaps the greatest contributor, created, Europe was created to avoid war. Europe was created after the First World War. I mean, we have forgotten about that, totally. And I don't know whether there are two readings of this. One, we have short memories, and I think that this integration can be quite dangerous, even today. Or another possibility is we have already solved the problem. There's no probability whatsoever that Germany will get into war with the UK, so that the UK doesn't have to have German officials telling them how to run their country. And that's the end of the story. Okay, thank you. These are just hypotheses I lay for.
Thank you, Jan. Very interesting. I'm sure Patrick will take care of that. Okay. Now.
Why not Patrick come here and I can go?
Which one is yours, Patrick?
I go here then, okay.
The slide job? This one?
I was doing a name tag.
Oh, no? You are in
I'm
Barcelona
Brexit
also?
in
They're on
10
the
minutes. No, I
flash
think I'm
drive.
on the flash drive.
On the flash drive?
Go to the other folder. Yeah, there you
Yeah.
Oh, here it is.
go. Brexit in 10 minutes.
Brexit in 10 minutes. We all tried before, so.
Is it here? Is that me? No, that's not me. Brexit in 10 minutes. Okay, well, while they're finding my slides, which say Brexit in 10 minutes, because I thought this was a difficult thing to do, but I'd try. I'd like to quickly pick up some points that have been made today, and most interesting. First of all, I completely agree with Ellen about barriers between the UK and the rest of the world. People often forget about these, but the EU has erected big barriers between the UK and the rest of the world because we're part of the EU, and that's an important point, and it's important for trade as well as for FDI. Also, I'd like to pick up a point of Joe's. I really liked his analysis. And one of the striking things is that nobody worried about uncertainty at all, except in the media, and of course at LSE. That brings me to Tom, whom I've been arguing now with for about, it feels like an eternity, but I think it's only 2 years. And I'll deal with him later. Now, Jaime, very interesting point about, the evolution of integration and small countries and globalization. And I think what we're witnessing is the rise of technology making it much easier to be a small state, because computers make customs borders virtually disappear, as I'll briefly argue later. And containerization has made distance disappear because it's so cheap to move goods from distant parts of the world to big developed markets. And of course, think about Singapore, think about New Zealand. These are both small and successful states. So turning to my 10 minutes. One of the things that came out of polling data is about 80% of British people are against European political union. They like democracy. And that actually is the main reason why they voted for Brexit. However, against this was the argument that it would damage the economy, which, of course, you've heard a lot about from Tom, what we call project fear. And the argument was, and as Tom rightly said, the Treasury and all their allies, LSE, National Institute, OECD, IMF, they all, and a bunch of others, they all kind of went on about the damage. First about uncertainty, which of course Joe has dealt with very well, and of course we've seen no evidence, and I think he's quite right about that. The statements were that there would be a collapsing growth in the short run, which of course hasn't happened. But then you've got the long run collapse of EU trade being forecast, and therefore the collapse of GDP in the long run. And this, as Tom kind of did explain, is based on this sort of approach of gravity, as it's called in trade, where distance, size, borders matter a lot. And there's various ways of doing it, which he did talk about. So what about the economics of Brexit? The point really that eluded most of this consensus, either eluded it or they deliberately ignored it, is that the EU is highly protectionist. It has tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers amounting to about 20% on quite widespread calculations, not just of ours, on both food and manufacturers. That's a very big trade barrier against the rest of the world. And then if you think about what makes sense for the EU and the UK, it isn't really to have no deal, it's to have a simple free trade agreement with zero barriers, you know. In fact, you know, the EU benefits from zero trade barriers, of course, with us, and there's no non-tariff barriers between us because we have basically convergence of regulations, and also benefits from free trade in services because the EU buys an awful lot of services from the UK, notably the city. So it's crazy for the EU to not have a deal. You wouldn't think that from listening to Monsieur Barnier, but Monsieur Barnier is playing a game, a political game of trying to sort of encourage us not to leave, but this won't work. Now, the other point that is important in all these costs of trade is this border. Now, there's a huge tradition in macro and trade of the costs of the border, going back to a famous article by McCallum on the Canada-US border. But you look at the Canada-US border today, it's shriveled to nothing, because if you cross from Detroit into Canada and back, you basically need your barcode on your truck or your car, and you just whiz through. I have a bigger border between me in Wales and Bristol in England. I have to cross a bridge, and I have to produce a card at a toll booth. They don't even do that. They just look, there's an eye in the sky. All borders today are virtual by virtue of WTO rules and the rise of computerized technology. And when we put the assumptions of abandoning 20% trade barriers against the rest of the world and virtually no barriers against EU because we have a Canada Plus type agreement, then there's gains from trade, from widening our trade with the rest of the world. This what seems to have eluded everybody. They're so bent on thinking about the tragedy of our trade with the EU, which won't happen, because of course we'll have a Canada Plus deal, and forgetting about the massive expansion of our trade with the rest of the world, as well as the sort of technology things that Ellen has talked about, which we kind of look at in the context of regulation and find the same sort of things. So, you know, on regulation, we think there'll also be gains. So I'll tell you about that in a moment, perhaps. Now, going back to trade, the latest UK government report, which isn't published, amazingly, but it's been leaked. We don't know who leaked this report, but somebody in the government leaked this report telling us what would happen if we left the EU. And it's apparently based on a model called GTAP, which is the second category of models that Tom talked about. It's a general computable, general equilibrium model of trade. And it has abandoned the original approach that Tom talked about, that the Treasury used. There were sort of lots of correlations about over history and so forth. They kind of abandoned all that. The civil service have now gone to a computable general equilibrium model of trade. But of course, what they've done is to put assumptions into it which are completely ridiculous about the huge costs of trade with the EU after we leave, which are basically a nonsense because of the WTO rules on customs and the fact that we're going to have a trade agreement with them. And when you put in the sort of assumptions I've talked about, on this huge GTAP model, which is the sort of leading world model of trade, you get a 2% gain in trade from Brexit. And if you put it into our model, which is a tested model where we've looked at, this is the fourth point here. If you put it into our CGE model, which is a more aggregative model, which we've tested on UK data, you get a bigger gain, but it doesn't really matter. The point is it's positive. And what people are trying to tell us is that we shouldn't have Brexit because, if we upset Europe in any way, if we get 1 millimeter away from Europe, the sky will fall in. Just like in Catalonia. We can talk about that later. I'm sure you're aching to talk about that. Now, last point. Yes, there is a bit of uncertainty. We need this government to sort itself out, but the government has made quite clear it's going for free trade, it's going for UK-based regulation, which would be more free market, therefore pointing in the direction of what Ellen's talking about, which we're very important, because there's a lot of technology change coming in the world in the next 20 years, and we need to be there to welcome it and not to drive it away with precautionary regulation as the EU does. And we need to control unskilled EU emigration, because what the EU has done is quite extraordinarily prevented a country from stopping people to come in to benefit from the welfare state, where wages are much higher in their own country than in their own country, and also benefits from the welfare state are high. Now, no developed country in the world outside the EU does this, but the EU has forced the UK to let in millions of people, actually, in fact, to be precise, just over 1 million unskilled workers from the EU who have full access to the UK welfare state, to the great loss of UK citizens. I've talked about uncertainty. I've talked about the long-term gains. When we add all these gains up from free trade, pro-tech regulation, normal border control, we come to quite substantial gains. And by the way, poor people benefit most, because what free trade means is prices fall. Prices fall on a wide range of goods, food and manufacturers in this case, and also because you stop this unfair competition and undesirable competition, subsidized competition from unskilled workers, the wages of unskilled workers also gain from the reintroduction of border controls on unskilled immigration. And that means that on our calculations, poor households do about 15%, get a percentage gain of about 15% on their living standards, whereas general consumers get a smaller gain because, of course, they're not so directly affected by these extra things. So in conclusion, it seems to me that, and I'll say this to Tom, all is forgiven, Tom. Now you and other economists should get behind this show and make sure we bring in Brexit policies of free trade, better regulation, and sensible borders.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. And I don't know who wants to start the discussions among you. Maybe you, Tom, I don't know.
Sure, I can start. Maybe I will actually start by highlighting an area where I think Patrick and I agreed, which is I think we both agree that there are barriers, that there are benefits to removing barriers to trade. We're not disagreeing about that. What we disagree about is whether the UK has lower barriers to trade as a member of the EU or potentially outside of the EU. right? So Patrick's perspective is that because the EU, as well as abolishing trade barriers between member states, creates barriers with the rest of the world, that cost outweighs the benefits of bringing down barriers between EU member states. Right? Now, the reason I think that perspective is kind of mistaken comes back to this issue that we've already alluded to of the importance of kind of gravity in international trade. And the fact that if you look at the volumes of trade between countries, the distance between countries is a really important factor that influences how much countries trade. And what's perhaps surprising is that despite all the wonderful technological advances we've seen in the last 30 or 40 years, the internet, containerization, the effect of distance on trade still looks roughly the same as it did 50 years ago or 100 years ago. There's a whole literature in economics devoted to kind of observing that this is the true and saying, wow, isn't that kind of surprising? But what it means is that countries trade most with their neighbours. Around half of the UK's trade is with the EU. The UK's next biggest trade partner is the US, which accounts for around 10% of UK trade. Right? So I don't think the possible gains in terms of increased trade with the US from, say, a UK-US free trade agreement, which I think is unlikely anyway, just can't compensate for the losses from lower trade with the EU, because the EU is always going to be the UK's biggest trade partner. Right? And I think that's why the importance of these gravity models is often what these debates revolve around.
Shall I say something about this gravity business? I've heard this so often, and so I tried to ask Tom to give us a proper gravity model. Give us a gravity model with all trimmings, computer general equilibrium, general equilibrium model. And he wouldn't. He always refused. He gave me lots of correlations and gravity equations. I know about all those. Tinbergen, Jan Tinbergen discovered them in 1962. But nobody really worried about this in trade, because if you write down a standard CGE model with standard demand relationships, you get a gravity equations out of it. And what we did was we set up, because nobody at LSE or the Treasury would set up a gravity model for us in general equilibrium, we set one up as a sort of variant of our model, which is just a plain vanilla computable general equilibrium model with sort of gravity mechanisms in. And remember, of course, all the things in the baseline of these models, are there anyway due to history. But what you want to know is, how does variation in the world, affect the behavior of the model? And basically, a plain vanilla computable general equilibrium model of the UK's trade, exogenizing the rest of the world, keeping the rest of the world as a given, passes pretty tough tests of matching the trade facts and regressions and correlations of UK trade, and a gravity version is rejected. So, I think gravity is there in the history and in the baseline, but the things that determine trade are still comparative advantage. And you ask the question of the UK, why does the UK have the City of London? The answer is it's comparative advantage. It's due to law, it's due to skill-intensive activities, a lot of quite smart people. It's also, of course, due to the fact that the city's recruited smart people from Europe too. And nobody's against that, because they pay their way. So, it's about comparative advantage, really. And the UK, of all places, has trades all over the world. Our biggest trading partner, a single country, is the US. Not Germany, not France, the US.
Okay, Jaume and Joe.
Okay. I'd like to just to make a question also a little bit like outsider, because you guys have worked on this you have worked on this. I would like to, this discussion is about the effects on trade. And then it goes into more detail. Should I use a gravity model? Should I use another type of model? What is important? I'm sure that many people in the audience and also in general will be lost, because Actually, I don't think that it was in the mind of the voters that voted for Brexit, whether trade with the rest of the world will increase more than decrease with Europe, or whether that was because of a gravity or which sectors. I think that there were many other factors, and they were mostly political. So perhaps I wanted to just bring and ask you, especially those that you guys come from the UK, and you might have been living, is why do you think was in the mind of voters? What was the most important element? And to what extent is it simply a dissatisfaction with the European state, with the way that the European Union works? Is this something, why? I don't think, do you think that really trade was the key element in the decision, or this is just what we economists are interested on? Joe,
Would you like to
Do you
ask?
want to go first? Or?
no, but Joe wanted to say something.
Joe, you wanted to say something?
I'll leave it open for
No,
everyone.
no, that's right. So I wanted to say two things. The first was about these computable general equilibrium models that we've heard a little bit about. And the GTAP model that Patrick mentioned is an example of one of these things. So these things sort of, I think, came into prominence several decades ago, used to analyze the potential impact of trade reforms. And they have a bunch of parameters. They're calibrated to match observed existing trade relationships. And then we feed in some changes in trade cost parameters and see what happens, right? And this is basically the kind of exercise I think that Patrick has in mind. The problem with these CGE models, as they're often called, and look, I used some of these in my own research, so I don't want to beat them up too badly, is that they have a pretty poor track record in predicting the effects of major trade reforms. NAFTA is a great example, sort of plugging some work of one of Ellen's colleagues, Tim Kehoe, back at Minnesota, my PhD advisor. Tim was one of the big proponents of NAFTA, and he used one of these CGE models to analyze the effects of it. And he was kind of beaten up in the press because his model did a terrible job of predicting which sectors would be responsible for the big boom in trade amongst the NAFTA countries. If you look at the individual commodities, the response of fairly disaggregated goods to NAFTA, which products saw the biggest boom in trade amongst NAFTA countries, the correlation between what we see in the data and the predictions of these CGE models is zero, or maybe even slightly negative. And the basic reason, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but the basic reason is that these models leave out what Tim calls the least traded product effect. When you see these big trade reforms, the big impact comes in goods that were barely traded amongst these countries at all. And CGE models leave this out. Now, that said, I think it's not at all clear what will happen in the reverse scenario. So, reduced trade barriers, this is what we see. Big boom in trade in the least traded products that were traded before. Not the kind of trade boom that we'd see in a CGE model. What will happen when we do the reverse, when we go to a protectionist scenario, raise trade barriers? I don't know. It may be that a CGE model could well do a pretty good job analyzing this. So I think, word of caution for using these kinds of models to analyze what's going to happen here. The one final thing I wanted to say was, Patrick mentioned something about the Canadian border, Canada-US border, being super open. One, that very well could be a result of NAFTA. We've got NAFTA, free trade area, certainly not the same kind of free trading goods, movement of people that we have here in the EU. But you might well wonder what the Canada-US border would look like in the absence of NAFTA, right? Second thing, relatively easy to move stuff across that border physically, but when it comes to the prices that Canadian consumers pay for goods compared to the goods that the prices that American consumers pay for goods, as well as the variety of goods that's available for Canadian consumers. And look, I grew up in the United States. I moved to Canada 5 years ago, so I've got a very good, anecdotal evidence on this kind of thing. Go to Amazon.com, for example, search for any product on the US version of Amazon, search for the same product in Canadian Amazon, do the currency conversion. The price is going to be 20%, 50%, 100%, 1,000% higher in Canada. So we certainly don't have entirely free trade even amongst NAFTA. And so, I guess the lack of a barrier, of a border there, or the low cost of actually moving stuff across that border, I think is understated when it actually comes to what consumers get. The prices that consumers pay when they go out and actually buy the goods that, are imported across that border.
Sure. I mean, so maybe kind of responding to Jaume's question about what was in the minds of voters when they opted for Brexit. Right? So, I mean, I guess the evidence we have to speak to that comes from the opinion polling. That's the best we can do. And it's very clear from that data that one of the big factors voters cared about was immigration. So opposition to immigration from the EU is one of the factors that kind of best predicts whether a voter would support Brexit. What's also interesting in that data is that self-reported opposition to immigration is very strongly correlated with support for leave. At the same time, if you look at the areas of the UK that have received the biggest inflows of immigration, those areas actually tended to vote more Remain. Right? So the areas that have received the most migrants from the EU actually tended to prefer staying in the EU, whereas at the individual level, kind of opposition to immigration is correlated with supporting leave. So kind of understanding exactly what is causing that kind of behavior is quite complex. I don't think we quite know what's going on there. But potentially it seems to be more about voters are more kind of afraid of immigration, whereas voters that are more exposed to immigration sometimes then end up kind of being more pro-migration. So I think that's one interesting feature to think about.
Yes, politics. Why did the Brits vote to leave the EU? I said it on my first point. They like democracy. The EU doesn't give any democracy anymore, unless you happen to be in charge of a minority blocking group of countries or people. And of course we're not, because basically the EU has a mindset for policy that is very kind of left-leaning, if you like. I'll put it as moderately as possible. And this is not shared in the UK. So I think that this is the first point, if you like democracy, you don't like being told what to do by a bunch of other countries. It's really quite simple. And then the reason we got talking about these wretched gravity models, right, and CG and all sorts of things, which you're absolutely right, went right over the heads of the people like whoosh, was because the Treasury chose to fight for the EU, not on politics, but on economics. And so, and all the economists joined in, you see, like Tom has said, all the kind of friends of the Treasury, you see, ganged up, you see, and said, we are a great consensus, and we think it'll be a terrible disaster for the UK to leave on economic grounds. And then, of course, the great British people thought, golly, all these economists, they all agree, apparently. So a few brave souls like us, and rather foolish ones, said, no, this is not true, not all economists agree, and tried to put the arguments why actually there's no reason why you can't be a small country, actually not so small country in the case of the UK, outside the EU as a third country, trading freely with the rest of the world, like many countries around the world. And we started from that point, and that's how it all got into this. And so let me move on to Joe's point about CGE models. Yeah, look, listen, there are correlations in the data which don't tell you anything, but a lot of people would have you believe they did, including my friends at LSE, who use lots of these correlations as one of their games. Correlations don't tell you anything. Yes, I like I like the idea of a deep theory model, of course. CG model is, in principle, a lot of theory in it. There's households, there's firms, there's cost functions. It's all in there. There's markets doing their thing. The thing about, I completely agree with your criticism of these vast CG models like GTAP. No one's tested them except, as you said, on NAFTA and various things where they went completely wrong. So I think that you're better off with a smaller model built in the same principles, which is what we tried to do, and testing it on the UK data, which is what we did. And I've got a slide, but I won't show you because we haven't got any time, where I show you how a gravity version of this matches UK data and how a non-standard vanilla version matches UK data. And it does match UK data. And the reason it matches UK data is the things that are in these models are pretty straightforward things like comparative advantage, stocks of factors, you know, things like trade changes in other countries. These are all kind of things that come in there, and they do match UK facts. So I don't think there's anything wrong with using a model. I don't think there's anything else you can do. I mean, you use a model, we use a model, but where I'm completely in agreement with you is you ought to test it against data, see if it matches. And ours does. I would like to assure you, my dear friend.
I mean, I guess the only thing I can say is, and I would have to, you know, admittedly, I need to dig into some of the details of what you guys have done, but when you say that it matches the data, this is where you lose me a little bit, in the sense that I use CGE models all the time. I have a preliminary one that I'm using to, you know, think about some NAFTA stuff.
We'll discuss these after.
But the point is, look, they all match the data initially. We calibrate the parameters so that they match the data initially.
Not that type of
Then
matching.
we make a prediction with the model.
Yeah.
That's where the correlations come in, and that's where they got it wrong with NAFTA. We have no sense of what's going to happen with Brexit until Brexit actually occurs. And then we can go back, you know,
Yeah,
with
but
the
a bit
benefit
late-
of
it'll be a-
hindsight
it'll be a
and
bit late
see
then.
whether the model
Shall-
matches what happened.
It'll be a
Any
bit late
model,
then.
Joe-
any computer
Joe,
model
it'll be
will
a
be
bit-
calibrated
it'll
to
be a bit
match the
late then.
current data. That
No,
says
no.
nothing.
Joe
No, it's
Patrick.
not about calibrating. Listen,
Joe
I need to
Patrick,
explain to you how we
Can
did it,
we,
but we
could
haven't
we
got
open
time.
the floor?
I'll tell you
Could we
afterwards.
open for the
I'll
floor,
tell you
because
afterwards at
otherwise they
dinner.
will not be able to ask any questions. You know, I mean, and I think they're quite. I don't know whether you're willing to make some questions, but please, yes, I have 2 questions already, 3. Okay, I think we still have a quarter of an hour, although we said we'll finish at 8:30. But go ahead. Here, 1, 2, 3 over there. Then yes, we'll take these 3 questions
Thank
and
you.
then we'll answer. For the panel, will answer.
Thank you very much for this excellent panel. I can't prevent making a comment to Mr. Minford's remark that you wanted Brexit because you like democracy. I would say we do too, at least I do, and yet I like to remain in the European Union. I have to make this remark
But
because
you're
I
not a
think...
Brit.
No, I'm not. So I respect, I understand your position, but I would like
It's
to...
different. I'm not
But-
saying the Spanish are
But
the same.
basically, I wanted to make a remark of a political nature. I think the likelihood is now that the UK will want to leave the Union and certainly to leave the internal market and the customs union, which poses a major problem to the borderline between Ireland and Northern Ireland. How is this problem going to be solved? I think for political reasons, and given the Good Friday Agreement, you want to keep peace in that area. At the same time, your government has undertaken not to establish a hard border there. But if you do leave the internal market and the customs union, how will it work?
Shall I quickly answer? It's called technology. It's really just like what I just said about the Canadian border. And by the way, I forgot to say that Canadians are very uncompetitive. There's not
I
enough
agree with that.
competition in Canada. That's
I
why you
agree
pay
with.
high prices.
That I agree with.
But you do have a hard border. There's a hard border, even though it's NAFTA. We will have a hard border with the EU, even though we will have an EU FTA, like NAFTA. And it'll be a hard border, but it will be... WTO rules say they have to be seamless, virtual. 98% of traffic between developed countries, the most developed countries, takes 98% goes up physically unchecked. And the other 2% takes a day. Those are the facts. And of course, in the case of the Northern Irish border, both governments are committed to having the best technology to make it completely seamless. That exists. That exists.
Can I just respond to that briefly? Which is, I mean, I think these technological solutions that Patrick's alluded to, they would be very nice, but I'm not sure they yet exist. Even if you look at something like the Swedish-Norway border, where Norway is still within the single market, there are still checks on lorries when they cross that border. And the problem is putting any kind of infrastructure on the Northern Ireland border is a threat to the peace process. And clearly, Ireland and the EU don't think that it's feasible to put any kind of infrastructure on that border. And that's why, the withdrawal agreement or the framework withdrawal agreement that was agreed in December, talked about maintaining regulatory alignment between the North and the South. Because if they do start to diverge, that means you need checks on that border. And though technology can help, it can't fully solve the problem of actually having infrastructure at the border. And if you have infrastructure at the border, you have a problem with the peace process. And I don't think we yet have a solution to that problem. There's a fudge that still has to happen down the road, unfortunately.
Well, let me quickly add, there is a technological solution. There may simply not be a political solution because the Irish and the EU are determined not to have one. And that's a different point. But actually, I think that once both these bodies realize that we're going to leave and that they can't play any more games, they will start to be sensible and we will use the technology.
We'll see to that. Okay, next question, please, over there. Thank you.
Good evening, and thanks to all of you for your valuable insights. Like the gentleman, my question is also of a political nature. I'd like to ask Mr. Sampson, you are certainly aware that there are movements getting organized in the UK to stop Brexit, to fight Brexit, but obviously if they succeeded, that would entail the very significant risk of the Eurosceptic press, the Eurosceptic parties, spending the next 40 years banging on about how Brexit would have been wonderful if only it could have happened. Do you agree that these organizations trying to stop Brexit are misguided and that Brexit should be allowed to fail on its own terms to debunk the very idea of Brexit as a viable option for the next 40 years? Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the nice things about living in a democracy is that you are allowed to change your minds, right? So if there is clear evidence that the UK public has changed its minds, I think it would then be perfectly legitimate for the UK to decide we want to remain in the EU. That said, if you look at opinion polling, it has moved very little since the referendum. There is no evidence yet that there has been a strong shift in favour of remaining in the EU. So based on where the polls are at the moment, I don't think that there is kind of a mandate to stop Brexit on those grounds. But if there were to be a shift over the next 12 months as people get a better idea of what Brexit will mean, I think it would be legitimate to kind of ask that question again in 12 months' time.
Okay, question over there.
Hola, bona tarda. Agrairia si li poden traduir la pregunta en català. Aviam, i volia fer una pregunta molt crua. A quins països s'hauria de veure reduïda la Unió Europea perquè el Regne Unit estés d'acord de no marxar?
He's asking how many countries the European Union should be reduced so as to make the UK willing to remain.
How many countries should be eliminated?
Should be eliminated from the European Union, Romania and so on. That's what he's implying, okay? All these million people and so on. Okay, go ahead. Continua, perdona.
Sí, perquè, aviam, amb la Unió Europea jo entenc que també aquí estem descontents, perquè la bírria de control que fa sobre la forma de gestionar els diferents governs al país. Per exemple, aquí concretament, bírria de control en com actua la justícia, bírria de control com són els sistemes d'educació, bírria de control com són el tema de les pensions. Gràcies.
He's complaining about how the European Union controls the performance of the governments, of each government. He's saying that our government is not doing a very good job in health, in education and so on, and how should the European Union control it a bit more? I'm not sure you would like that.
Well, I don't know. I have no idea how to answer this question.
Well, you can answer the first. You could answer the first one.
I mean, it's addressed to me, so I can't avoid it. Okay. Well, if I can't avoid it, the UK actually was very positive in bringing new countries into the EU. It brought in the whole of East. It was instrumental in bringing in Eastern Europe. It pushed for that very hard and was supported by Germany. But the problem is really, I think, that the EU is really an organization which doesn't really respond to popular opinion in any way. This is the fundamental problem. And contrives to do things in a way that upsets a lot of countries and groups of people within countries. And therefore, I think it's got a very big problem ahead in its evolution. And I can't really see a solution for it. The euro has been a disastrous decision against which many of us warned, because it's led to very difficult imbalances inside the EU, and particularly terrific damage to Spain because of the inability of Spain to use its own monetary policy and its own exchange rate policy. And it goes on making these things, making these wrong decisions. On immigration, it's been completely disastrous. Now it's trying to build much more intervention at the center to deal with the problems of the euro, all of which I think will aggravate political tensions. And although you want the EU to control Spain more, I don't suppose that's a widely shared opinion. And I think the more the EU gets into the business of controlling countries like Spain and Greece and Italy, the more it will be highly unpopular and lead to more movements of departure, like ours.
Thank you. Any more questions? No? Then let me ask a question myself. There is this big discussion between hard Brexit or soft Brexit. In the UK, which I was there for the weekend, everybody assumes it's going to be a hard Brexit. They are only questioning what will this imply in reality. But somehow soft Brexit has gone down the tube. So what's your feeling about it? And both of you, the British the speakers, and what will this imply?
Well, look, I mean, as the Treasury and all the consensus of economists argued during the campaign, a soft Brexit, which is no change from the status quo, without being in the EU, is about the worst of all possible worlds. And yet now it's being pushed as a sort of better alternative than hard Brexit. But hard Brexit is simply Brexit. You leave the EU, you know. You leave the EU, it's pretty simple. You leave the single market, you leave the customs union, and you dump the immigration process, because that's part of the single market for freedoms. You just leave. And that, of course, the government is committed to. But the free trade agreement with the EU may have some subtle compromises, which, of course, we can't really, at this stage, know. I mean, I think it'll be more subtle than simply having no relationships over customs duties, for example, with the EU. It's possible that there will be some sectors where there will be some alignment. We don't know about this. This has to be determined in detailed negotiations. But it's certainly going to be a situation where we leave these institutions and then have a free trade agreement which is negotiated ab initio, like the Canada one.
Okay, what's your feeling, Thomas?
I mean, so obviously, I mean, the UK government is currently committed to leaving the single market and leaving the customs union, and it says it wants a bespoke free trade deal with the EU, which maintains as close market access as possible, while allowing it to negotiate its own trade deals and to control immigration. The difficulties the government faces and that Theresa May faces are kind of twofold. One is the Northern Ireland border problem that we've already talked about. It is not clear that leaving the customs union while maintaining a frictionless border in Northern Ireland is possible, right? And the government is going to try and kind of make those two things happen simultaneously. But a lot of people think that can't be done. And if it can't be done, then there's a question of which do you give up on. The second kind of key challenge they face then is that what is the EU actually willing to give the UK? And rightly or wrongly, the EU's position so far has been that if you don't stay in the customs union and you don't stay in the single market, you also can't have a bespoke agreement. You can have something that looks like the EU-Canada free trade agreement, but that is a long way from being the kind of current levels of integration we have, right? So to pick one example, one of the reasons the City of London is so successful is that I can set up a bank there and provide services to clients across Europe through what are known as passporting rights, which come under the EU single market. EU-Canada doesn't make any kind of arrangements along those lines. So EU-Canada type of arrangement would mean the UK would lose market access in financial services. And the government, I don't think quite yet has decided kind of how it wants to play that trade-off. So it still needs to sort of make the decision. In the long run, are we going to push for more access and maybe give up some sovereignty in exchange? Or are we really going to go for the kind of harder Brexit and accept that that will mean a loss of market access? And, and for anyone that's been following the press in the UK over the last week, the UK cabinet was supposed to meet last week to decide the government's Brexit policy, and they kind of failed to come up with a policy, and they pushed it back for another few weeks. But there's still a live debate within the UK government about exactly what they want from Brexit. Right? And I think that debate reflects the fact that there's a debate in the country at large. We're still basically split 50-50. Half the country wants to leave, the other half of the country wants to stay. And those divisions that the referendum exposed, they haven't healed at all in the year since. And until they do, you're not going to have any kind of unified position from the UK.
Oh dear.
Well, anyway, let's leave it. Thank you very much. That last sentence rings true to us, 50-50 split, but let's leave it at that. Thank you very much for the very interesting conference, and well, thank you to you all. Moltes gràcies.